All right, I'm joining you guys from my real office today. I figured the best way to introduce the Renaissance is by giving you guys a brief timeline of the events that helped introduce the different cultural elements that would become recognizable as Renaissance. So I've made a real live timeline here, and hopefully I can hold this in a way that you can all see it. This is going to be up here for a while. Copy it down, feel free to do so. Now notice that my timeline starts over here with the Roman Empire. Now, even though the Roman Empire is separated from the Renaissance by 850 years, they're still directly related, and I'll explain to you why when we get there. Now, during the Middle Ages, which is this orange section over here, there's 850 years of progress, but it's sort of a slow, grinding process that's held under tight control by mostly the Holy Roman Empire throughout that period. But it's a period that the gospel and the authority of the church is the ultimate. Now, in here, the only note I've really got there is about Charlemagne. Now, we know that Charlemagne ended up unifying the people of what would become Europe, which would allow that later to, in fact, become Europe, which is a big deal. But there's another thing that he instituted, which is the ability to inherit and accrue wealth from one generation to the next, which seems like it wouldn't be that big a deal, and it wasn't to begin with. But when you pair that to what happens during the Black Death, then the ability to inherit wealth becomes pretty significant, because when you have a population of people, a working population of people that's cut down by a third, then the remaining two-thirds of that population can now demand a significantly higher income to do the work they've been doing basically the whole time. It's just supply and demand. So if you were a laborer who was fortunate enough to survive the Black Death, you were probably making a lot more money than you were before the Black Death. So this leads to an emerging middle class. You've got, people who are becoming laborers who are being responsible with their income and becoming a wealthy middle-class family. This is the first time that we've seen a middle class in a very long time. In fact, possibly ever. Up to this point, the stratification has basically been you're a member of the aristocracy or you're a Yemen farmer of some sort. All of a sudden, we have this middle class, and this middle class of people now has enough money to focus on things other than just how we're going to feed ourselves, how we're going to survive. So one of the first things that this middle class does is they become literate and educated, and that's what we have down here. So you have a literate, educated population who is really interested in self-improvement and pursuing their own curiosities. So this idea becomes so popular that colleges and universities begin to pop up around almost all the city centers in Europe, and education becomes something that is just really a commonplace pursuit for these emerging middle-class families. You've got people who are becoming educated. You've got people who are traveling a lot more. You've got people who are going on more pilgrimages, people who are exploring other cultures. So this really is it's an interesting time to be alive, especially if you compare it to what was happening during the Middle Ages. So you've got all these middle-class people that are pursuing an education. In order to build a college and university, you have to have a structure, you have to have instruction, and you have to have books, at least theoretically. So at the time, there was a desperate need for a printing press. So when it shows up, it meets the needs that all of this literate population and all these colleges and universities have. The problem is, where do we find books to print? Where is this actual reproducible knowledge going to come from, being that we're just emerging from 850 years where almost everything that's written is gospel, or at least related to the gospel. So they have to look back even further than that, and that's where the Roman Empire becomes relevant again. As Roman culture is what produces the manuscripts that people are beginning to read once we get to this phase in our timeline. The printing press is available, so when people are bringing things to be printed and reproduced and accessible to the public, those are works of classical literature. They're works of philosophy and theories about social dynamics and pursuits of the sciences and the arts and things like that. And that's what leads us to the term Renaissance itself, really. Renaissance means rebirth in French, and what it's a rebirth of is classical thought and culture. Classical thought and culture is Roman thought, Greek and Romans. The Greeks and Romans are the classical cultures. So whenever we use the term Renaissance, what we're talking about is just a resurgence of interest in all things classical philosophy, classical thought, classical artwork, architecture, just everything that was old is new again, that whole thing. So when people start reading all these classic manuscripts, a few themes emerge. One of them is humanism. Humanism is a key tenet of classical philosophy, and it's a lot of different things, but most to the point that we're interested in, it's the belief system that we as human individuals are capable of doing really great and impressive things. We're created in the image of a God and are therefore great by our general nature. In addition to that, there's a really safe gray area for the sciences that begins to open up, in that saying that, we ourselves are great and we ourselves are fascinating because we ourselves are built in the image of a God. It covers us, but the natural world around us was also created specifically for us by that same God. And by not investigating and exploring this natural world that's been made for us, then we're really doing a disservice to this great gift that has been bestowed upon us. So the sciences really begin to become a lot more of a factor in day-to-day society and culture, because all of a sudden it's safe to investigate these things. It's safe to come up with answers that follow some early version of the scientific method. Now, it's really easy for us to look back at this period of time and see it as one concise 250-year period of cultural growth. But at the time, nobody would have realized that what they're experiencing was this explosive growth in culture and technology. But we have the benefit of looking back on these things in retrospect, which makes it a lot easier to classify. Now, the term I haven't mentioned up here yet is this one right here in that big red circle. And this is the term Medici or Medici family. They were a wealthy Italian family who have been referred to over and over again as the godfathers of the Renaissance. That's because they were involved in basically everything, and they're the quintessential, middle-class Renaissance success story. They started out as shepherds, a shepherd family who eventually became so responsible with their money and developed enough resources that they could basically become wool merchants, and they began to make a lot more money by reselling not just their wool, but the wool of other shepherds from around the Florence area. Now, this led to them establishing a base of income that allowed them to develop what I believe is the world's, or at least the Western world's, first private banking system, at which point they could loan out money. And not only could they collect interest off of the money that they were loaning out, but they were also in a position to be able to loan people money for the sake of being able to call in favors later, which turns out to be a lot more valuable, especially when you're dealing with the ancient world, the Renaissance era world. Politics is huge, and having people in your back pocket politically and financially has always been a huge advantage. And the Medici family took advantage of this over and over again. Now, they were patrons of the arts. They funded dozens and dozens of really noteworthy projects and specific artists throughout Florence. Anything that was done that was even remotely secular, the Medici family had something to do with it. And then a good percentage of the work that was done that was associated with the church was still funded by the Medici family, despite the fact that the Medici family were seen as being direct competition for the Pope himself. That's how powerful the Medici family became, is that they were becoming powerful to the point where the Pope himself felt threatened by the control that they had over the way that culture was developing and the resources that they had. And this was a huge point of tension for a very long time. But then eventually the Medici family, they were so resourceful that they even bought their way into the Catholic Church, and there were two popes that were from the Medici family, at which point the Medici family had control over the financial and spiritual world throughout Europe, and could not have been more powerful. I can't think of any one family to compare them to today, but if you think about the Kardashians and the Kennedys coming together to form one family, it would have been the Medici family. Not only were they extremely well connected and powerful in the political world, but people were also really interested in what it was that they were doing. They were trendsetters. They were the ones who sort of determined what was going to become fashionable from one year to the next. But the Medici family, you're going to see in the following videos, are involved in just one thing after another. And there's really good representation of how things progress, throughout the entirety of this particular timeline.